Hello and a very warm welcome to the University of Westminster. We are now starting the online information session for the International Relations course pathways. I'm joined by the course leader, Aidan Herr, who will be presenting on how we should study global affairs with a case study on Syria and the International Relations course pathways. Before we start, I just wanted to say that there is a chat box in the right-hand corner of your screen. So if you do have any questions, please do post them there and we will hold a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So now over to you, Aidan.
Okay, hello everybody. I hope you find this webinar interesting, and I will be attempting to give you a flavour of what it's like to study here at the University of Westminster and to talk you through some of the course structures with respect to the different MA programmes that we have. My name is Dr. Aidan Herr, and I'm a reader here in International Relations. I've been with the university for since 2007, and I will hopefully be able to give you some ideas, as I said, about not just the content of the courses, but how we study here in the university. So what we're going to be looking at today is, as you can see from the agenda, starting off with this question of how should we study global affairs, looking specifically at this case study of Syria. And then I'll go into some more details about the course itself in terms of an overview of the different courses we offer, the structure, the kind of modules that you can take here, the assessment methods, and then the entry requirements, and of course, importantly, issues regarding careers and employabilities, and the loans and scholarships that we offer as well. Okay, there is as my colleague stated, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions towards the end, so I hope to hear from you regarding those. Okay, in terms of the first part then, the idea here is just to give you an idea of how it is we encourage our students to think about international affairs. Our three MA programs all relate to some extent on relate to international politics, or international relations as the discipline is known. And in that sense, it's important for us from the beginning to get you to understand how we'd like you to think about international relations. As you can see from the first slide here, I've given the kind of a choice between repeating what you've heard or analysing what you read or what you hear. For most people, the university is an opportunity to engage with lots of different ideas, not just to have your understanding of the world confirmed. So when you come here and study with us, you will be engaging with people from all over the world, both staff and students, and you will be exposed to different ideas, different theories, different understandings of why people behave the way they do and why states act the way they do. Now, what we like to encourage students to do is not just to think if somebody, Professor X says this is the truth, then it must be the truth, but to think in terms of if Professor X says this, what does Professor Y say? And then you start to get a plurality of views. You get different opinions on the same subject. And that's why on the right-hand side of your screen there, you can see we encourage people to study in a particular way, which is to analyze, rather than just reading books or journal articles and repeating what's said in those books and journal articles. We encourage you to obviously read those books and journal articles, understand what they mean, but also engage with an alternative viewpoint. Now, what we mean by analysis then orientates around this idea here. This definition goes to the heart of much of what you'll do if you do come here, right? It's an explicit engagement with an assessment of differing perspectives on a particular issue or proposition, and the articulation of a preference based on this engagement. Now, basically, this is a complicated way of saying something quite simple. We expect you to, as it says in the first part of the sentence, show us that you've engaged with differing perspectives. So show us that you've read what person X says, but also what person Y says. So we can see from your bibliography or from your essay itself that you have engaged with people who hold diametrically opposed views. Okay, so for example, the invasion of Iraq. You show us that you've read a particular book or article that says this was illegal and immoral. But additionally, you show us that you've read a journal article or a book, or you've watched a TV program or an interview with somebody who says actually it was the right thing to do. Okay, so you demonstrate you've engaged with both sides of the debate, which is very, very important. But equally important is the latter part of this definition, because what we then want you to go on to do is tell us what you think. Right? Now, whatever your educational background in the past has been, when you come to study here at the University of Westminster, you are encouraged to give your opinion. Right? So if you have been discouraged from doing so in your undergraduate degree or your schooling in whatever country or that you happen to study in, forget about that when you come here. We want to hear what you think. Now, there's a difference between a rant and an analysis. So if you have no basis for the claims you're making, it's a rant. If, however, you have engaged with two sides of the debate or more than two sides, and you say, here's what I think, then we say, yes, that's an analysis, right? And there's no right or wrong in that sense. So you may have a view of the invasion of Iraq or the situation in Syria that I personally don't agree with, but that's of no importance. What is important is that you can demonstrate there is a basis for the claims that you make. Now that's a great opportunity for you then to provide, we provide you with this, the scope within which to write assignments, write dissertations, engage in in-class debates where your view is valued. Okay, and we absolutely encourage that. And one of the great strengths of our MA program is that we have people from all over the world with various different perspectives, and we encourage inclusive debates in the classroom and certainly again in the assignments that you do. We want to hear your views. An example of that then, if we think about the world today, giving you some images here of various different things that are happening at the international level. Okay, you have in the top right-hand corner of your screen here an image from Syria, which I'll talk about in detail. Below that you have an image taken of Rohingya refugees fleeing Myanmar. Then you have obviously below that the situation in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, particularly centered around the issue of Crimea. In the center of the screen you have the image depicting the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. Brexit is obviously a major issue here in the UK at the moment. Below that you have an image of refugees marching through Calais, and below that you have a very different issue, but still one that is clearly on the international agenda, which is the issue of North Korea's nuclear weapons. The top left you have Donald Trump, obviously, and beside him you have what are described as kind of populist leaders of political parties in Europe, and in the bottom left-hand corner you have ISIS, an image of ISIS, the terrorist organization. So if you were to open up the newspaper today or tomorrow or last week, you would find one or two or more of these issues being discussed. There is huge amounts of things happening at the international level at the moment, and most commentators would, I think, agree that the vast majority of these things are quite negative. The "May you live in interesting times" is a famous Chinese curse, which is to say that we hope that you live through times that are quite tumultuous and quite dangerous, effectively. So if we look around the world today, we see all these various different issues. Okay, problems with terrorism, problems with nuclear weapons, problems with the rise of the far right and populism. What do we do about ethnic cleansing? What do we do about conflicts inside states that involve massive human rights violations? All these kinds of things. Now, we encourage you to engage with all of the different issues that take place at the international level. Naturally, we don't expect you to have an in-depth knowledge of all of these different things, but we absolutely encourage you to be up to date with global affairs. But we also think that it's important not just to be fixated with events and stories and things that are happening in the news, but to look, to go beyond just the headlines and to look a little bit deeper. Now, what we kind of encourage then is to think about, well, what's causing all this? Why do we have this vast array, this bewildering array of what seems to be at times, never-ending negative news on our screens all the time? We therefore encourage you to think about things like this. What's causing all this? Again, I'll just give you some images to represent that. Think about the bottom right-hand corner here. You've got the sign here about revolution tools. You have AK-47 and machete. These are crossed out. We have Twitter and we have Facebook with ticks beside them. Now, what this image represents is the idea that we now live in a world where revolutions don't happen in the traditional manner with respects to arms and weapons, but it's through social media. Now, if we think about the Arab Spring in 2011, for example, this was something that many people argued was impelled by social media. It was a huge change that swept across North Africa and the Middle East, and it was driven by grievances, long-standing grievances, but it was certainly aided, the spread of this movement was aided by a Twitter revolution, by Facebook, by social media in general. Now, we live in a world, therefore, where something has technologically evolved to impact on international affairs. The image in the center at the bottom here of the UN, this is something again which crops up many times. You see the image of the UN as being a boat which is clearly imbalanced, and you have the Secretary General of the UN saying, "I've told them it's unbalanced." What does this mean? Well, the 5 animals at the right-hand side of the boat represent the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So you have the US, the UK, Russia, France, and China. The animals on the left-hand side of the boat are the rest of the members of the United Nations. Again, what's this got to do with international affairs? Well, one of the issues that crops up time and time again when we study international relations is the question of international law. Why hasn't the UN done something about Ukraine, about Myanmar, about Yemen, about Syria? The answer to that can be found, again, according to some people, in the structure of the United Nations itself, and specifically the problem that we have 5 permanent members of the Security Council who have the capacity to authorize or veto resolutions put to the Security Council to deal with different situations. Now, this is something that's come up many times in the context of Syria, which I'll talk about in a minute, where you've had repeated vetoes cast by Russia and China with respects to the international response to Syria. So where was the UN in Syria? Many people would say the UN was unable to act in Syria, not because the majority of member states didn't want to do something, but because 2 states in particular stopped the UN from doing it. Similar argument will be made with respects to the situation in Palestine, that the United States has always supported Israel and will always veto any attempt to censure Israel at the UN Security Council. Likewise, you have a situation between the United Kingdom and Bahrain and various other different groups like that that are allied with one or more of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So we have the UN, we have a vast body of international law. The problem is, how do we enforce it? And can it be enforced if we have this imbalance at the heart of the United Nations system? The other images again reflect different issues that have cropped up in the last 25, 30 years. You have in the bottom left here what many people describe as the McDonald'sization of the world, whereby Western culture has moved into different parts of the world in the post-Cold War era through the process of globalization. And this has meant that we have McDonald's and Topshop and Costa Coffee in many parts of the world that were, clearly not previously within the Western capitalist orbit. Now, for many people in these countries, this is a welcome development. For other people, it's seen as an assault. It's seen as an attempt to impose cultural hegemony, and they resist that. And this resistance has manifested in various different ways, one of which, of course, is the growth in support for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS, for various different terrorist groups around the world who see this imposition of Western values as I say, a cultural assault, and they're reacting against that. So it's more than just a cosmetic problem that the streets of capital cities in the Middle East and Africa have changed their character and begun to look more like Western capitals. It's also seen as something much more fundamental, an attack on culture, and it has led to what's people like Chalmers Johnson, for example, would say is blowback, an attempt to fight back against what people would argue is Western imperialism. Likewise, at the top here we have the image of populism. In the previous slide, I talked about Donald Trump and various different parties that have emerged in the last 10, 15 years in Europe, and of course Brexit as well. A lot of people would argue this has been impelled by the rise of populism. Populism, of course, is something that has a long lineage, but has become much more of a force in the last 10 years. And of course, why? Why is that? Again, you have people who would say it's a reaction against neoliberalism. People don't feel that the promises that were made to them in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War have come to fruition. People feel let down by their governments, that they don't have the money they were promised, they don't have the lifestyle they were promised, they feel relatively deprived. All these issues, coupled of course with people's fears surrounding immigration, have led to an emergence of movements within the heart of the Western world that seem to be very old-fashioned, xenophobic, people would argue racist, all these various different things. And not just, of course, in the West. In the last 24 hours, obviously, we've had the elections in India, which again, many people would ascribe to the rise of populism, not just in the West, but across the world. So why do we have these political parties and movements? Populism, many people would say, is the answer. Linked to that, then, you have these two images in the top left, the BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the image of Uncle Sam, looking quite bedraggled and begging for money. What these symbolize is the decline in US power. And this, again, is something that has had a profound effect on international relations in the last, certainly at least the last 10, 11 years. Since the global financial crisis in 2008, people have written extensively about the decline of the United States and the rise in the power of the BRICS, particularly Russia and China. Why does this matter? Well, again, in the post-Cold War era, the emergence of the West as the dominant power internationally meant that Western powers were able to largely set the agenda internationally regarding the spread of democracy, regarding human rights, regarding capitalism, regarding how you should organize yourself internally as a state. Now, as the power of the West grew in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, these issues became manifest through humanitarian intervention, for example, which happened, of course, in Kosovo in 1999 and much more controversially in Iraq in 2003. Also in terms of state building, which took place in many parts of the world, and of course the spread of democracy and spread of capitalism. As the US has gone into decline, however, we've started to see in the last 10, 11 years, China, Russia, and to a lesser extent, but still to a significant extent, Brazil, India, and South Africa, starting to assert themselves more at the international level. And they have a very different view of human rights, of democracy, of what a sovereign state is entitled to do internally. And these norms and these ideas have therefore impacted on the international response to various different issues. Now, in particular, people have argued that the international response to the situation in Syria has been very clearly influenced by the changing distribution of power at the international level. Now, just to give you a flavor of this then, just to focus on Syria now, what I'd like to kind of get you to think about with respects to this is that there are various different ways of studying Syria. You can read about the various different things that have happened on the ground, about the machinations and the diplomacy at the international level. You can look at it in terms of what does it say about politics, what does it say about regional studies, about international law, about human rights. But what I want to focus on today, just to give you kind of an example of how we would study something like Syria, is to focus on the international response to Syria, particularly the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and to kind of talk you through how we would think and we would kind of present this to you as a way in which to kind of identify not just the situation itself as being interesting, but the broader themes that the situation in Syria raises. One of the obvious starting points, I guess, has been the fact that, as this image points out, there's been many people calling for something to be done since the situation degenerated in late 2011 and particularly in 2012. So this has been going on for 8 years, essentially. We're not dealing with a crisis that people are unaware of. The international community, the international media have covered the situation in Syria in great detail for many, many years. As this sign says, where is the world? There's increasing frustration, anger, horror even in some quarters that we have stood by and watched as people are slaughtered inside Syria. Now, on the one hand, you have that sense of, well, we should have done something. We should have intervened, okay? And we should have saved these people's lives. On the other hand, you see this image here. This is an image taken from an anti-war demonstration. And you can see the signs here, hands off Syria. Now, what these people are arguing is that we shouldn't get involved in Syria, that we have experience of intervention in countries previously, Western intervention in countries, and it went badly wrong. The obvious example that people would point to is Iraq in 2003. So many people who would make the case that we shouldn't do something to help Syria, it's not so much that they think we're happy to let people in Syria die, it's the sense that, well, can we make the situation any better? And the shadow of Iraq in particular, but also to a lesser extent Kosovo and Bosnia and Afghanistan, has impacted on the nature of the debate surrounding Syria and the international response to Syria. Likewise, you have this cartoon here where you have a depiction of President Assad in literally a bloodbath, which again is the country of Syria under his tenure in the last 8 years, the cartoonist would suggest. What he's saying here is, I'm quite capable of cleaning up myself. Somebody is holding out UN sanctions. Now, what the image is trying to point to is a problem that orientates around the nature of the international response to Syria, specifically in terms of international law. What can we do when we're faced with a situation like this, where a leader of a sovereign state engages in willful violation of the human rights of his citizens, or at least the people living inside the state? The problem we encounter straight away with that situation is that Assad can say, and of course he has said, I'm the leader of a sovereign state. Sovereignty is something that provides states with independence. And by definition, that means I'm allowed to the freedom to run my own affairs internally. The problem with that view, of course, is that there is a body of international law that says, well, there are limits to what you can do as a state. So fine, you're a sovereign state, but it doesn't mean you can commit genocide, for example. We have a genocide convention. It doesn't mean you can commit ethnic cleansing, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. So we have this clash between what the law says and, of course, what certain state leaders interpret the law as saying. More importantly, we come back to that point about the Security Council, whereby Assad can say, not that he would do so explicitly, but he can say, ultimately, what are you going to do about it? My friend, Russia, and to a lesser extent China, will always protect me from international censure. If you attempt to pass a resolution at the UN authorizing military intervention in my country, I know that Russia and China will veto that resolution. So we have a problem with respect to international law, which is a long-standing problem, not just related to Syria, which is that it doesn't lack legal prescriptions. It contains laws regarding everything: racial discrimination, gender discrimination, human rights violations. The problem is enforcing these laws. How do we enforce these various different laws, particularly in a situation where one or more of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council believes that that particular state and that leader is their ally? Final issue to raise regarding Syria in this context is the complexity of the situation. Again, a cartoon here highlighting this. Got the anti-ISIS coalition. Okay, all these people are against ISIS, but they're also, as you can see from the cartoon, against each other as well. One of the more obvious features of the conflict in Syria has been how complicated it is. Okay, who is aligning with who? You have various different international actors involved. Obviously, you have Iran, you have Russia. You also, of course, have Israel, the United States, Turkey, various other different regional powers. And internally, within Syria, you have various different groups and movements, some of which would present themselves as liberation movements, who are pro-democracy, other ones which, again, people would say have very dubious intent. So we're dealing with a situation which is inherently complicated. We're not looking at a crisis where there is an obvious bad guy, if you will, and an obvious victim that needs to be saved. There is various different groups involved in the situation which complicate the articulation of a simple solution to this particular crisis. So we've got these various different issues that stem from the situation in Syria, which are quite obvious when you look into it. How do we then kind of think about Syria in these different terms, right? How do we use Syria as a case study, right? Think about it in these terms. Well, what's the point of a case study? Okay, what I've suggested here is these 3 different things. A case study should reveal broader global trends and test their effects. Secondly, case study should explore the accuracy of a particular theory. You use a case study to say, well, there is a theory that exists. Now let's see if that theory is actually true when we apply it to this particular case. And thirdly, to develop transferable lessons. The idea here is that if I look at Syria in detail, I can say the situation in Syria suggests the following things about international relations in 2019. That therefore means that the international response to Yemen, to Israel, to Myanmar, to Venezuela should also evidence similar features. Now, the key thing to kind of note regarding this is that when you are here and when you're looking at these various different things, particularly with respect to your dissertation, your case study is an example. It isn't your argument in and of itself. It's an example that you would use to make a broader point. Now, if we go through each of these three questions in turn with respect to Syria, I'm just going to give you some examples of how you could answer these questions. First one, the first point, highlight broader global trends and test their effects. What you could do with respect to Syria then is look at the revolutionary potential of social media. Has social media impacted on how the international community has responded to Syria? Now, again, there's no shortage of Facebook posts or Twitter posts providing visual and video evidence of what's happening on the ground in Syria. But of course, that leads us to the problem of fake news. How do we know any of this is true? This is one of the issues surrounding, for example, the white helmets in Syria. Are they genuinely progressive good guys, if you will, or is there something more nefarious going on there? Okay, so social media in that sense is something that, again, Syria could potentially highlight, that social media is now a force in international relations, but it may not be a positive force. Secondly, the obvious one, the decline of the West and the rise of the BRICS. Does Syria suggest that power at the international level has ebbed away from the United States and is moving towards the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa collective? Again, you could look at the extent to which, again, many people would argue Russia has effectively won the war in Syria, that it is Russia's side which has prevailed in this particular conflict, that Russia and China have demonstrated the willingness to repeatedly veto resolutions sanctioning action against the Assad regime in a way that they certainly didn't do in the 1990s or the early 2000s. Third issue that could arise from this, of course, is the limited power of the UN. If I want to show you that the UN is not very powerful, that it has a lot of laws and a lot of processes and procedures, but it doesn't do very much, maybe you could look at the case of Syria. You could say, look, UN officials have been going to Syria for the last 8 years and coming back with reports saying human rights violations are taking place on a daily basis and Assad is responsible for that, but that has been met with a collective shrug. And you have a bizarre disjuncture then between the reports, the official UN reports, and the actual action taken by the UN. The fourth one, the role of morality in international politics. Again, it would be difficult to think that there are too many people who have looked at the images coming out of Syria over the course of the last 7 or 8 years and just said, who cares? Maybe some have, but most people would look at this and think this is terrible. But is there any link between moral outrage and actual action? If we can accept that people look at images of death and destruction and say that's terrible and that therefore people do feel bad for the victims, does that actually mean we can say that impacts on the response of states to these crises? Again, a lot of people would say it simply doesn't. People look at these images, but they then change the channel. They then click on something else on Facebook. They watch YouTube, whatever it is. Moral outrage doesn't actually translate into action by states. Other people, of course, would say there are many countries around the world that have benefited from moral outrage, where people have said, this is terrible, you have to do something, and their governments have been forced effectively to take action to stop whether it was famine or whether it was human rights violations or ethnic cleansing or genocide in different countries around the world. And they would say that the power of social media can generate momentum behind action taken by states. So that's an ongoing debate, and Syria could be used in either side of that particular debate. The fifth one, of course, is sovereignty and legitimacy. Many people would argue, certainly Western states have argued, that Assad's actions since 2011 have stripped him of any legitimacy. He's not the legitimate leader of of Syria. Other people, of course, would say that's not for you to determine. Sovereignty is something that should be preserved because it enables people to evolve independently, to create their own political systems, and that's a good thing. The alternative to that, they would argue, is some form of colonialism. But of course, there is this tension then between, okay, sure, you know, it's a good idea that people are allowed to create their own political systems, but there must be a limit, surely. Many people would argue that genocide and ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, once you cross that line, you've lost your right to sovereignty, that the international community should become involved then. Particularly popular idea at the moment is the idea of the responsibility to protect. Now, that's something, again, which stemmed from the debates in the 1990s about sovereignty and legitimacy and human rights violations. And it's something that, again, has been tested in the case of Syria. Of course, most people would tend to agree that it simply hasn't affected the international response to the situation on the ground in Syria. So in terms of this first point then, broader global trends, there's at least 5 that I'll give you an example of there. The second issue respects to case studies. Explore the accuracy of a particular theory, okay? Again, you look at the different issues I've listed here. Why do people rebel? What is it that compels people to take up arms or even engage in pacifism and civil disobedience against their governments? Okay, Syria could be your example here. Okay, it's a good case study in that sense to highlight that perhaps there is a point at which people say, right, that's it, I've had enough. You know, and even though I know the state is very strong and very violent, I'm going to rebel anyway. Secondly, the end of history or the clash of civilizations. Now, these are two big theories that emerged in the 1990s. The end of history was this notion put forward by Francis Fukuyama that the West had won the Cold War and the West was now going to spread its values and its political system around the world. It would be the spread of democracy and the spread of capitalism. The clash of civilizations was a different view. This was Samuel Huntington's idea that, well, the world is going to experience different types of wars in the coming era, and they will be wars between civilizations. Does Syria prove the end of history, or does it disprove the end of history? Does it prove the clash of civilizations? Does it disprove the clash of civilizations? Okay, how do we understand what's happened in Syria? How do we interpret, rather, what's happened in Syria in the face of these two different theoretical perspectives? The third one, again, is this idea that we must save them. This is an argument that many people have made in the context of humanitarian intervention. Who are we and who are they? Do they really need us? By virtue of creating this idea that we should help them, are we not engaged in a form of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, we would argue? Are we not saying we're better than them, they need our help, and we're going to give it to them? That it creates this hierarchy in international relations, that we have the solution to their problems. It also obscures the extent to which, this is the argument, we have created their problems. So many people in the case of Syria would say, okay, let's just take a step back here. Western states have supported Assad historically, have provided him with political, economic, military support, going back many, many years. For them to turn around then in 2011 and 12 and say, oh, Assad is a bad guy and you know he has no legitimacy, obscures the fact that we actually created the problem that many people in the Middle East are now suffering from. So likewise with respects to other regimes across the Middle East, whether in Egypt or Tunisia, Western states propped up these regimes. So we must come to their aid is a sentiment that many people find unconvincing. So again, what does Syria tell us about that? Fourthly, no such thing as humanitarian intervention. This is a proposition put forward by Alex Duvall, and he would say that states never behave morally. States are only interested in geopolitical material gain. And they may call something a humanitarian intervention, but it's actually war. Right? They're not interested in protecting and preserving human rights. Other people, of course, Alex Bellamy, for example, Gareth Evans, various different people like that would say, no, states do care about human rights. And we can convince states to take action on the basis of human rights. So you have that ongoing clash there. Now, again, Syria. Why, for example, did Donald Trump launch 2 sets of airstrikes against Syria? He said it was to protect, in his words, beautiful babies. He saw these terrible images of beautiful babies killed by chemical weapons. Is that why he acted? Or was there more self-interested motivations? Finally, you have the idea here, victims, nurses, grieving mothers. What I mean by this would be the feminist analysis of the international response to these crises. From a feminist point of view, women are presented either as victims, as nurses, or as grieving mothers. They're never agents in the crisis. They need to be saved, essentially. And we use their bodies and their experiences and the terrible things that happen to them to legitimize male aggression, effectively. So a feminist analysis, again, of Syria would highlight, again, the extent to which women have been portrayed in a particular way. Final point regarding this, then, in terms of the third issue, to develop transferable lessons. Okay, you could look at this in the context of Syria and go, well, okay, what does Syria tell us about counterinsurgency? How do you deal with an insurgency inside a state effectively? Secondly, in terms of propaganda, obviously one of the big features of Syria in the last 8 years has been the propaganda war that's been going on. You have obviously the pro-Assad faction, you have the pro-rebel faction, the people in talk in favor of the Kurdish forces, that Russia is doing the right thing, that Russia is evil, that the United States is doing the right thing, that the United States is evil, all these various different things. Okay, what does it tell us about effective propaganda? And again, that could bring in the question of social media. Thirdly, the capacity of crises to spread. One of the problems with respect to Syria, of course, is that it hasn't just been contained in Syria. The issue has spilled over into surrounding regions, creating one of the catalysts for the crisis in the Mediterranean with respect to refugees and immigrants that's been so prominent the last 4 or 5 years, if not longer. And of course, the instability that has spread to other countries. Okay, what is it that can trigger instability in a surrounding region? Fourthly, you have, of course, the question we talked about here, limited willingness capacity of the West to act. If Syria highlights that the West is limited now, it doesn't have the capacity or willingness to take action, does that impact on the Western response to Myanmar, or the Western response to Yemen and different crises around the world? Again, if it happened in Syria, perhaps the lessons of Syria can be applied elsewhere. Finally, need to strengthen international law. Okay. Ultimately, do you look at what happened in Syria and go, well, we clearly need a different UN, we need to reform the UN Security Council, and we need a different set of laws and procedures so that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Now, ultimately, just finally on the question of Syria, to give you an example of how you could draw this all together, if we take these 3 points again about the case study, to reveal a broader global trend and test its effect, perhaps you could come to the conclusion that multipolarity, which is the emergence of new powers internationally, has reduced the capacity reduced the West's capacity and willingness to undertake humanitarian interventions. That could be your finding. Secondly, explore the accuracy of a particular theory. Okay, appeals from global civil society for Western states to do the right thing will not overcome geopolitical considerations. So we could argue here that, look at Syria, it shows us that despite this huge campaign that was waged by global civil society, by media, by social media outlets, all these various different groups, to get the West to do something, they didn't do anything, ultimately, because it wasn't in their interest to do anything particularly substantive. And thirdly, an example of to develop transferable lessons, you could argue if human rights are to be protected, the international legal order must be reformed to enable the impartial enforcement of international law. Now, you could, 10 people could write about Syria and come up with 10 completely different answers to each of these 3 questions. And that's the beauty of research. You can do the same thing. You can study the same thing. You can look at humanitarian intervention in Syria and come up with very, very different conclusions. Now, as I said in the beginning, we would encourage you in the course of your research into any particular issue, whether it's Syria or whether it's the rights of, let's say, homosexuals in Russia, or trade relations between the United States and Canada, anything like that. We would encourage you to engage with different perspectives and, crucially, give your opinion. Okay? Now, just to give a bit of background to politics and IR in Westminster, when people come here, I think they tend to be very impressed by the variety of the different issues that we discuss. We've got researchers who are actively involved in all these different key areas. I'm not going to go into them all in great detail here now. You can look at these on the website, but all of the people who teach you at Westminster, each of your lectures, they are experts in the particular subject that they're teaching you. Now, being an expert means you're somebody that is writing, is research active in that particular field. Okay, we have these various different research groups in CSD, which is the Centre for the Study of Democracy, and we actively engage with contemporary research in these different areas, which means therefore that you are being taught by somebody who knows the field and will be able to guide you in whatever particular area you wish to explore. In terms of the learning and teaching at Westminster, one of the things, just a kind of obvious point to note, is that you're in London. Right? Now, London is a big city. Lots of things are happening in London that specifically relate to the kind of courses you could do here and the modules that you would be taught. There's talks on all the time in London. There's huge amounts of foreign embassies in London that put on talks about what's happening in their country. There will also be massive amounts of non-governmental organisations. We're also very close, of course, to the Houses of Parliament. Lots of events happening here as well. So being in London and doing a degree relating to international relations is, of course, a huge advantage because there's an awful lot happening that you can plug in with. Secondly, interacting with staff. I'll put this together with the third point about politics and IR events. We put on an awful lot of events related to the various different issue areas that I talked about previously here. So we have these different key areas. Staff will put on events related to these areas. So for example, we might get somebody to come and talk about their latest book or talk about a particular issue that's happening in international relations. And what we expect and what we really encourage is that at these events, you come and you talk to staff. We don't want it to be a situation where the only time you meet members of staff is in the lecture room, effectively. Right? We're very approachable. We set aside office hours every week that you can come and see us, but we also encourage people to come and talk to us, not just in office hours or after lectures, but if they have an issue they want to discuss with us, or they just want to talk to us about a particular book or article that they read, we tend to do very well in terms of student feedback about our engagement with students. A couple of points about attendance study. You are expected to attend, obviously, the seminars, and you will have to study. Goes without saying in many respects, but this is something, again, that to get the best out of your experience here, you have to turn up. Okay, each class is 3 hours long. If you're a full-time student, you'll be here for 3 classes every week, so you've got 9 hours of actual teaching time. And in addition to that, obviously, you have to supplement that with a significant amount of study. The way we teach then, in terms of those 3 hours, what we have is a seminar rather than a lecture. So you won't be in a situation where I will be just stood in front of you and talking at you for 3 hours. Generally what happens is the lecturer introduces a topic, talks about it for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then opens it up to a debate. They will tend to have provided some reading for the class previously, and you will then discuss that particular reading. And again, talk in a way that is open to all different perspectives. Okay, we have various different things we can provide you with, of course, then on the first day, including the module handbook, which will guide you towards various different reading that you should do on a weekly basis. We encourage you to prepare for the seminar in advance so that you've read the books and the articles beforehand, you have something to say, you undertake independent research. I've talked before about the need to read widely, engaging with social media, obviously, and the point about analysis. Okay, so again, it's very much, you get much more out of the 3-hour classes if you've prepared in advance and if you've engaged with different perspectives. The course overview for each of the 3 different courses, I'm not going to talk too much about that now. I know time is running out a little bit, but you can look at that more in detail online. In terms of the modules that you do here, again, this is available online, but just to very quickly say, you have a core module every semester. Okay, you can look at the different courses that you're doing here. Depending on which course you're doing, you'll have a core module. Each semester you do 1 core module. You also do your dissertation and your research methods. In total, you have 180 credits. 100 of those credits come from the 2 core modules and the dissertation. Everybody does the dissertation, but as you can see, depending on your MA, you'll be doing different types of core modules. That therefore means that you have option modules. Okay, each student chooses 4 option modules, 2 options per semester, different for part-time students, obviously. But in the course of your time here, whether full-time or part-time, you will do 2 core modules, a dissertation module, and an additional 4 option modules. Now, again, the option modules are listed on the website, and you can see there that there's a huge variety to choose from, which of course is fantastic. So 2 of you may be doing an MA in International Relations. You come out with an MA in International Relations, but actually you could have done completely different option modules, and you tailor those option module choices to your own particular research interests. Just a quick word about the assessments as well. We don't do exams here. So the assessments we use include essays, book reviews, presentations, policy reports, reflective logs, lots of other different things like this. This has been highlighted by the external examiners as being one of our key strengths as well, that we have a great range of different types of sources, and they're not simply, you know, forcing you into a room to sit down for 2 hours and write an exam paper. Okay, it tends to be much more research based. Finally, a couple of little bits about the entry requirements. First class or upper second class honours degree or equivalent. Additionally, if you don't have a degree in a subject that's directly related to this, or if you don't have a first or second class honours degree, but you have, for example, work experience that is directly related to this, then we would encourage you to apply. If you have work, for let's say your undergraduate degree was in computing, but you've worked for the last 15 years in the foreign office of your particular home country, then clearly we would say yes, you're qualified on the basis of experience. And we have IELTS requirements as well for those of you that don't speak English as your first language. Lots of different things you could do in terms of careers and roles. You see them listed here. We have a career development centre in Westminster, which has a careers and employment service, which will help you obviously to think about shaping your career going forward. One of the great strengths of an MA in international relations or international relations, democratic politics or security is that there are lots and lots of different avenues that you can explore. We also run various different workshops on how to, for example, write CVs, engage with interview situations, and to apply for jobs more generally. Funding and scholarships, some things here you could look at online as well if you wanted to, but just to highlight these going forward, there's lots of different avenues you could explore here. Just to kind of say at the bottom as well about the scholarships, if you're doing it, if you plan to do a MA part-time, the deadline is actually the 1st of August, but for full-time students, it's the 31st of May. Okay, so as I said, think about it in terms of a very open environment where we encourage you to read widely and analyze, to give your view ultimately, right? There's an awful lot of information about the kind of nuances and the minutiae of the degrees themselves online, but you can certainly email me and ask me to provide you with any information or any of the course handbooks if you want to, but I'm also available now to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. One of the first questions we have is, if we have a follow-up question, how would we contact you, Aidan?
Okay, I have a page on the University of Westminster website. It should also be clear on the course information pages, my email address, but I'll just call it out now, which is a.heihir@westminster.ac.uk. So that's a.heihir@westminster.ac.uk. As I said, it is also available online, so please have a look at the course information pages, and my email address will be listed there too.
Thank you. Our second question is, are there any events or activities that you can get involved in as part of this course?
Yes, there are many. One of the great strengths of the department is that we have lots of people here who are research active and who want to put on different events and activities. To be honest with you, it's unlikely that you would be able to attend everything we do. We do so many different things. There's at least 2 or 3 different events on every week in terms of external speakers coming to talk about it, or reading groups and things like that. So yes, we have an extensive program of events that you will be provided with when you come here in September or January, and you would be encouraged throughout the course of your time here by module leaders to attend these events. We have an email distribution list, of course, that you would be added to, and you would be made aware of these events going forward. We also have, which I'll give you the details about in a few minutes, a presence on Facebook and on Twitter. I'd also just like to highlight that we do run a trip to Brussels every year, which takes place in April. And we take students to see various different European Union offices and organizations, and also NATO and some non-governmental organizations as well. Now, that's supplemented by the university, so the cost is quite low, and it's a fantastic opportunity, obviously, to see how international relations happens in the real world, but also to network, to talk to prospective employers going forward. So that's something that we run every year as well, a study trip to Brussels.
Thank you. And our final question, what is the dissertation support available for students on this course?
Okay, the dissertation is the most important piece of work that you do here. Okay, it's worth huge amounts of marks going forward, and it's something that obviously you need to take a lot of time over. It's worth 60 credits, which is a third of the overall marks for this, for whichever course you do. Now, your dissertation is something that you decide yourself what the question is. So, you know, it could be anything, effectively. You could be looking at women's rights in Nigeria, you could be looking at the question of nuclear proliferation in North Korea, whatever it happens to be. What happens is that you are assigned a member of staff who is an expert in that particular area, and he or she then helps you to structure your question, to undertake the different methodological issues that you'd need to address, and to ultimately put forward an analysis of the particular question that you want to answer. It's a fantastic opportunity, really, to really kind of dig your teeth into something in detail and in depth. And we've had such a wide variety of dissertations over the years that, again, it's great for us every year when we get the list of people who want to study the different things, because it's always very interesting to see what people want to study. If you like doing research, then you will certainly enjoy the dissertation. And what I always say to students as well is to think in terms of something that you enjoy, that you would like to research, not something that you think is easy. Okay, so again, if you happen to be from a particular country that's had a civil war, or had a transition from authoritarianism to democracy, then maybe you want to write about that. And that would be your case study. It wouldn't be the only thing you talk about in your dissertation, but you can certainly build on your own personal experiences, whether in your home country or in your work or something like that, that relates to international relations.
Thank you. That's all for questions now. We'll just briefly go through the next steps.
Okay, as you can see listed here, there's a postgraduate information evenings. The next one is on the 5th of June from 5:30 to 7 o'clock on the Regent Street campus. And again, you can see the web link there to get more information about that. Additionally, in terms of the application process as well, if you have a look online at the web links here again for the 3 different MA courses, have a look at that first, obviously, but if there is any questions that you have, please email me. I'm more than happy to answer them, and of course you can come to the postgraduate information evening as well. And finally, in terms of contacts, have a look at the Facebook page, and also you could follow the department on Twitter, okay, which again will provide you with a flavor of the kind of things that we do, and also some information about forthcoming events and staff research news.
Thank you. So once again, thank you very much. A recording of this presentation will be available after the webinar, so we'll get that sent out to you soon. And if you are keen to find out more, please do come along to our postgraduate information evening or get in touch via one of the email addresses provided earlier. Thanks again.